All right, this is the second half of section 2. We're going to talk a little bit about human rights and some of the arguments within the academic world about what human rights means and how they're viewed and what they are exactly. And first, we have to talk about the difference between citizenship rights and human rights. Okay, citizenship rights are those you get from being a citizen of a certain country. Human rights are rights you get because you're a human, right? Citizenship rights come down from your government to you. Human rights kind of come from below. They come from just the fact that you're human. The very matter of your birth creates these human rights that need to be respected. Whereas citizenship rights depends on what country or what region of what country you live in. So a great example of citizenship rights is voting. Right here in the United States, you have to be a citizen of the United States in order to vote in our elections. And no matter what some media pundits might say, if you're not a citizen of the United States, you don't get to vote, and in fact, they don't vote. But human rights are things like the right to free speech. And here in the United States, we grant everybody the right to free speech, whether they're a citizen, a non-citizen, whether they're here illegally, legally, on vacation, whatever. You still have the right to free speech because that's not a citizenship right that only citizens are entitled to. It is a human right that everybody is entitled to because they're human. Okay? But there are kind of three factors or three parts of human rights that are people argue about. When the human rights academic circles, they want to talk about, and there are different philosophies on these different aspects of human rights. Are human rights universal? Are they incontrovertible? And are they subjective? And we're going to go over each one of those three in turn. So first, are they universal? Right? Do they apply to all humans everywhere throughout time? And the kind of philosophy behind saying yes, human rights are universal, is that all people are part of this worldwide community that transcends politics. Like there's something that comes above politics, and that worldwide community of humanity has these rules that are human rights. So in the modern day, what we try to talk about, or the way this has become phrased, is this concept of natural law. Okay, natural law essentially says that over and above what humans write down as laws, i.e., what I can go look up in the congressional documents of these are the laws that Congress has written. Over and above that, there's this thing called natural law, which is where human rights come from. This is, the things that all those people were talking about in the last subsection. People have the right to dignity, and people are valuable just because they're people, and people have the right to not be tortured, and all those things are part of natural law, which supersedes and is more important than the law that humans kind of write down. So some of the arguments against natural law are this, like, the very fact that you're claiming something is universal throughout all time, throughout all space, it kind of is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people, right? So they go back to, are you saying that 5,000 years ago, in even the most basic areas, people had these rights, and it's just their governments didn't recognize them? So this universality is a hard kind of pill to swallow, especially when you look at history and see how few governments throughout history have really kind of gone with that whole human rights thing. And then there's just the fact that cultures are different, you know? In the Western tradition, we look at rights as belonging to the individual, as in, I am one individual person, thus I have rights. Whereas many of the Eastern traditions, and, you know, kind of non-European traditions, look at not the rights of the individual person, but rights of the community, rights of the tribe, rights of the family, things like that, where it's not necessarily that rights belong to any individual person, it's that they belong to the family or the group or the tribe or the, you know, whatever kind of unit of measure you want to talk about, but it's not any one person, it's the rights of the many people. And as such, this whole natural law thing can kind of run afoul of how does that apply to these other cultures where rights aren't seen in the same way as they are here in this, you know, kind of European dominated society. If they view rights not as something individuals have, but as something communities have, does the whole natural law thing still apply? So this cultural difference throughout the world and throughout time kind of is one argument against human rights being this universal thing that has existed throughout space and throughout time. Now, are they incontrovertible? I.e., is there never a time when these rights can really be taken away, right? They can be violated. Everybody agrees that the human rights can be violated, but can they be taken away and you no longer have that right? And the vast majority of the time when we talk about this taking away these rights, we're talking about the state, right? State action. Can the government take away my rights for any reason, right? Citizenship rights, we all agree. They can take away our citizenship rights for lots of reasons. Not any reason, but lots of reasons, right? Because citizenship rights come from the state. So if they come from the state, then obviously the state is able to take them back. But since human rights come from below, they come from the fact that we're human, what rights can be taken away and when, right? So looking at human rights, we have to decide which human rights can be neglected and when and how, right? Because we can have two people whose rights are conflicting, right? One person has the right to free speech, but when his free speech violates the right to not be harassed and discriminated against and threatened, then this person's right to free speech and that person's rights to not be discriminated against and threatened are in conflict. And whose rights should we side with? Whose rights? We have to negate somebody's rights, right? We either have to tell this guy he's not allowed to say those things, or this guy that his right to not be threatened and in fear of his life is, we're taking that away, right? So when these rights conflict, we have to determine whose rights we're going to side with, right? And that necessarily creates the need to create this hierarchy of rights. So all these different rights that we all agree we have, you know, going back to previous people, life, liberty, and property. Well, which one of those is most important? And when my right to liberty and your right to property conflict, which one wins, right? And then there's a debate about rights versus duties, right? So some people say that rights come with duties, i.e., for every right you have a duty. So if you want the right to free speech, that means you have the duty to listen to speech that you don't like. But there's a difference between positive and negative duties, just like there's a difference between positive and negative rights. And here I'm not using positive and negatives to mean good and bad. A lot of times in English, we kind of use positive and negative to mean like positive, oh, that's awesome, it's good, yay, yay, positive. Here I'm using positive and negative to mean kind of active and passive. With a positive duty is you have to do something. A negative duty is my duty to not do something. In other words, I have a duty to not act, right? So my right to free speech implies the negative duty of stopping, I'm not allowed to, I shouldn't stop other people from speaking, right? That would be a negative duty. In other words, my duty there is to not do something, to not stop this other person from speaking. So Locke, back in the day, he was the guy that originally said, life, liberty, and property. He says human rights, because they're human rights, they cannot have a positive duty attached to them. They can have negative duties attached to them, but they cannot have any positive duties attached to them, i.e., my human rights cannot come with a duty for me to actually go out and positively do something. They can come with a duty for me to not do something, but they can't come with a duty for me to actually perform some action or do something. Paine comes along, and he was the guy writing right after the American Revolution, remember? And he says, no, human rights can absolutely have positive duties. In other words, the fact that you have rights implies duties, right? Your human rights have corresponding duties, and those duties that your human rights you have just because you're human can absolutely be duties that are positive, i.e. things you have to do, right? So this isn't an example Paine used, but from reading his work, an example might be, I have the right to life. But that implies the positive duty that if somebody near me is drowning and I have the ability to save them, I have that positive duty to save them, because humans, all humans, have a right to life. And if I have the ability to save somebody, I have the positive duty to do that. Does that make sense? And then last, subjectivity. And this means they apply to people, right? They apply to, whether it's individuals or groups, they apply to people. But what makes humans special? Why don't dogs have human rights? Or, dog rights that are the same as human rights? Why don't cows have cow rights that are the same as human rights? And this is a much harder question to answer than it might seem at first glance. So a famous guy, Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. He says basically that humans deserve rights that animals and such don't, because they're rational. Because they have that rationality, that ability to reason. And that is what makes human rights important, and what makes humans different from everybody and everything else that we found so far in humanity. We have the capability of reason and rationality that nothing else we've found in the universe does. The problem is that kind of subtly shifts, then kind of by implication, this shifts the human rights. So it's not the human itself that has the rights, it's the rationality within the human, right? So now what if we're talking about humans that definitely don't have rationality? A newborn baby has zero rationality, but is it still deserving of human rights even though it's not rational? Does a person in a coma who can't communicate in any way, and most people would agree it's not rational, do they have human rights? Right? So it's a really hard question to answer. What makes humans special? Why do we get rights and not anybody or anything else? And then there's the problem of individuality, right? Are rights for the individual, or are they for groups? Are they for the community? Or for the family, or the whatever? Well, there's a group called communitarianism, or communitarianists, who says, look, your rights only matter in a community. Because think about it, if you're the last human being on Earth, you're the only person there, you never interact with any other human being, are your human rights even important? I mean, who's going to violate your rights if you're the only person there? So in other words, rights aren't a thing that can even be talked about or discussed except in reference to this community. It's the community that is the most important factor in rights, because without the community, there's no need for rights. Does that make sense? So, kind of the evolution and the how modern human rights philosophies and laws and all these things have changed. It kind of went through these three stages. So first, there was this discussion of natural law, i.e., there is a law over and above what humans have written down as law. That natural law is not always agreed upon on exactly what it says, but people have the right to life, liberty, and property. People have the right to dignity and value as humans, right? But there's this natural law that provides human rights that is over and above and more important than anything that humans might write down in a law book. Okay, so that was kind of the first big thing in modern rights, the modern rights process, right? Second is the assertion of positive rights. So one of the first government groups to sit down and write about positive rights was the United States with the Bill of Rights. They said, we're going to actually say you have these rights. You have the right to free speech. You have the right to be against unwarranted searches and seizures. You have the right to not be given cruel and unusual punishment. You have the right to a lawyer. All those things are positive rights. We're expressly writing down you have these rights in a formal political way. Now, the biggest thing and the most recent major shift in human rights thinking is the combination of those two things. And what we're going to talk about in future sections is the first combination of these two is really the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made by the United Nations in 1948. They sat down, the United Nations got together after World War II and said, look, World War II, that was really horrible. The Nazis did lots of really bad stuff. So did the Japanese. I mean, both those groups did really horrible things to their people and other people, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. So we're going to take this natural law idea, this idea that there's some law that's more important than just what any individual country writes down. And we're going to take this idea that we need to assert positive rights, i.e. we need to write down that, all people have the right to life. All people have the right to free speech, And we're going to try and do this international, worldwide set of rules and positive rights based on this natural law that all people, no matter what country they live in, deserve to have recognized because they're human. Okay? We're going to talk more about that in later sections. That's the end of section 2. Thank you so much.